Hello, welcome. I'm Suzanne Miller. I'm chair of the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Society, and I'd like to welcome you here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special evening. Please stay for some delicious refreshments after the talk, and we'd like you also to pick up some of the handouts on the back table. One is a pie chart of where your income tax money really goes, which ties in very nicely with David's talk. Another is a petition to ban weaponized drones from the world, which I'm sure you'd all like to sign. And the third is Presente, which is the newsletter of the School of America's Watch, which is against our military training of forces in Latin America, which has done so for so many years that we have been doing that in Georgia. So please stop at our table, and then, of course, David will be doing some book signing after his talk. So you can see the many books, including his current one that he has written. We have two videographers here tonight, Joe Stillman, who will post David's speech on YouTube, and Wilton Vaught, who will broadcast it on his blog called Other Voices, Other Choices. Both the talk and question and answer session will be taped, but the camera will only focus on the speaker. Tonight's event is funded by a grant from the New York State Convention of Universalists, and it's co-sponsored by Schoharie County Peacemakers and the SUNY Oneonta Social Justice Society and Africana Latino Studies Club. The students from those two organizations were here earlier, 5:30, for a talk and discussion with David and a little pizza, and there's lots of pizza left, so you can have some yourselves after with a lot of other refreshments. So Lisa Barr will now introduce our speaker. Thank you again for coming.
And thank you, Suzanne Miller. Suzanne Miller uniquely made this event possible by taking on the responsibility for writing grants. Let's give Suzanne Miller a big round of applause for bringing our speaker here tonight. David Swanson is an author acclaimed by the likes of such great Americans and citizens of the world as former Marine and Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, but he began as a journalist. Writing for small and medium-sized cities' newspapers was stifling him economically, and there was the oft-described conflict between personal morals and personal income. That is the U.S. journalist experience in a land in which key documents regarding the assassination of John F. Kennedy are still kept secret, in a land in which the Journalism Academy has been perverted with Pentagon dollars since right after World War II's end. Please see the citations in your program for more information on why David and other journalists found the U.S. newsroom a very strange place indeed. You can read about David Swanson's experiences at his personal website, Let's Try Democracy, and other blogs. He's quite prolific. Simply put, after doing day-to-day journalism, he found a better paying job, more than doubling his income in Washington, D.C., writing newsletters for labor unions and businesses' human resources managers. He told them going in he would never say anything to harm a union, but that he would be fair. That wasn't good enough. They wanted him to draw blood and tell businesses how to beat those unions. David sought other work. He was Acorn's first and only director of communications before it was destroyed by Roger Ailes' Fox News. Then he went to work as press secretary for Dennis Kucinich, for president. Kucinich, of course, was not elected president and returned to Congress. David went to work for peace groups. At one point, Senator Kucinich asked David to research articles of impeachment against George Bush II. David began researching, and along with a few other people, David helped produce 60 or 70 good articles of impeachment. From these, Senator Kucinich picked 35 he wanted to use. on the floor of the Senate. It took hours to read them aloud. You can buy it in a book or find it on David's website, but David points out that within a year of President Obama taking the White House, David did return to those same articles and found that President Obama had also violated the majority of impeachment articles, as had Bush II. David says when he points this out, he is accused of being non-peaceful, but he's about to tell you nothing could be further from the truth. So I'm going to turn things over to the author of War is a Lie, the second edition. We ask you to listen to David Swanson's comments with an open mind and, more importantly, an open heart. And then during questions and answers, David Swanson says it's okay to question his authority. Please help us welcome David Swanson.
Supposed to stand on this? Thank you. Wonderful to be here. Great to see a new crowd. We just had an event with students and now presumably with largely non-students, but we can all try to be students for life. I'm trying my best to. Oneonta seems like a wonderful place. I went downtown and got lunch, and at the restaurant there was a wooden post that said, "May peace prevail on earth," in 4 different languages on the 4 sides. And I understand some of you are responsible for those. And it's a common sentiment. It would be nice to have peace on earth. It's also a common sentiment that we need to have wars. And if we're wise and reasonable and rational and not infantile and unreasonable and too idealistic, then we're going to have wars. I had a school board member where I live express his willingness to back a resolution celebrating the International Day of Peace, as long as we made very clear that in doing so, he wasn't opposing any wars. Now, this is something that doesn't happen with other evils. You know, we try to get peace through war. We don't try to get, women's rights through rape or, human rights through torture. It's only with war that we try to get peace with its opposite, using its opposite. There's this contradiction, and it's very hard for people, especially in this culture, I think, in the United States in particular, to see all the way around that and say, let's get peace through peace. And let's not use war at all in order to get peace, because we've been trying that for decades and it's proving counterproductive. And there actually is a better way. How many of you have been hearing about this meeting last week at the Vatican about peace? A good number, not everybody. The Vatican hosted a number of peace advocates from dozens of countries around the world last week, hosted by the same cardinal who was the driving force behind the Pope's encyclical, the Pope's formal statement on the climate and the environment. But this meeting was about ending the pretense that there can be such a thing as a just war. I mean, this is 1,700 years of precedent, of harm, of legitimization of mass murder, and the Catholic Church is looking at undoing it and say, as a matter of fact, you can't have a just war any more than you can have just child abuse or just slavery. War is unjust, and from now on, this church is going to be in favor of a just peace. Well, now the thinking and the hope and the push is for the Pope to follow through on this meeting that was, almost universal, overwhelmingly in support. And its final statement said, yes, let's do this. Let's put out this statement of new official church doctrine that we don't support war ever anymore. And so the Pope may soon release an encyclical opposing all war and saying anyone in the world, any Catholic, non-Catholic, should not participate in any war, should not participate in any weapons manufacture, which is part and parcel of war. This would be remarkable. And I say this as a non-Catholic and a non-Christian. I think the impact, the influence of people with this sort of prominence taking this position is dramatic. And while I think competition can be very much a part of the problem we're dealing with, I think the Unitarian Universalist Association should try to get in first, before the Catholics, and say, we condemn all war. We are opposed to all war. I have this book about war from a particular angle, and that is the lies. The lies that are used to justify starting wars, the lies that are used to justify continuing, escalating, the lies that make wars look better after the fact. And the point of entry for most people into this today is Iraq 2003, because you had incredibly incompetent lying about starting a war. You had lies that were very easily and dramatically refuted. You had glaringly obvious intent on starting a war with lies, and those lies exposed and new lies presented, and by a Republican, so it wasn't acceptable the way it would be if, with a Democrat. And this is where people come to with, I had very smart people say to me, this hasn't happened since Vietnam, or this hasn't ever happened, a president lying about a war. And so I went and looked at every past war by the United States and many other countries, and I couldn't find one that hadn't been started and continued and beautified after the fact with very similar lies. You go back to the previous Iraq war, never mind the deadly sanctions that killed hundreds of thousands of children and adults, but the Gulf War. In the lead up to the Gulf War, you had Kuwait hire a public relations firm in Washington, D.C. to coach and prep the daughter of the ambassador to go and talk to Congress and pretend that the Iraqis had taken babies out of incubators in a hospital and thrown them on the floor to die. I mean, you had this whole pretense concocted that was nothing but a lie and used to start a war. And dozens of others in that war and in the later Iraq war and in the previous. And when you start looking a little more deeply, you have to go back and say, well, why was the United States supporting this government in Iraq and arming this government in Iraq and keeping this dictator in Iraq in power that it now claims this urgent need to overthrow? And when you go back and look at the history of a particular country and question why now a dictator who's fallen out of good graces in Washington needs to be overthrown for humanitarian reasons, and you start looking at all the other dictatorships, even in that same region of the world where the United States is supporting and arming brutal governments right now, and you have to have, why not stop supporting those rather than overthrowing this one? And you go back and look through the history of wars, and they all start to look very, very similar. Nobody, really celebrates the War of 1812 very much anymore, though there was an anniversary a few years back now. But this was supposed to be a cakewalk. The Canadians were supposed to welcome the liberators with chocolates and flowers, and they didn't. They said, "What are you doing here? Get out of our country." As the Iraqis said so many years later, as the Canadians said on numerous occasions, not just 1812, but as this country would say if it ever happened here, which everyone has this ongoing paranoia that it's about to, which, by the way, it isn't. You go back and look at the war that stole half of Mexico from Mexico. Mexico was willing to negotiate, was willing to sell half its country. The United States preferred to do it with war and preferred to start that war with a blatant lie about a Mexican invasion that was not a Mexican invasion. You go back and look at 1898 and a ship called the USS Maine blowing up in Havana Harbor, and Spain saying, you want to accuse us of blowing up a ship? We had nothing to do with it. Let's take this to arbitration by a third country, independent international panel. We will submit to any ruling. There's no need for a war over this. And the United States, in particular the newspapers in the United States that thought it was good for business and could bring the government along with them, said, oh, no, we want a war. We want a war. This was, before the claim of last resort was really applied so prominently to every single war as it is now. Now, war is always the first choice, but it has to be marketed as also a last resort. The Lusitania was a blatant lie before World War I that there weren't arms and troops on that ship. The Gulf of Tonkin incident that was used to get the war in Vietnam going, even though it didn't happen, and had it happened, it would have been a question of U.S. aggression in Vietnam, not Vietnamese aggression in the United States, and so on. So you go through all the list of bad wars, and very quickly, as has been going through your minds already, people start saying, but what about the good wars? You're only talking about the bad wars. What about the good wars? And we just had a conversation with a group of students here for the past couple hours, and they happen to pick the same good wars that have been picked in every room I've been in this country. And they were, of course, World War II and the Civil War and the U.S. Revolution and Rwanda. Rwanda may have moved into second place now, but World War II is overwhelmingly the justification for military spending in 2016 and 2017 and onward. It is overwhelmingly the top topic of U.S. entertainment and U.S. culture. It is our central myth of the top spending program in our government, World War II. And I think it's interesting that with nothing else do we go back 75 years to find a legitimate example of its use in order to justify it. If the education department had been making everybody more ignorant for 75 years, but it educated somebody in 1941, would that justify hundreds of billions of dollars every year into the education department? Or if the Department of Transportation had been keeping people from leaving their houses for 75 years, but in 1941 it moved somebody down the street, would that justify, but with the biggest spending program, over half of discretionary spending by the Congress every year into militarism, into preparations for wars and also wars, you go back 75 years to find an instance to justify it, even though it was a completely different world, a world of colonialism and empire and no nuclear weapons and completely different systems of government, and a world in which nobody knew the power of nonviolence. Nobody knew what nonviolence could do. And the women whose protests were so effective in the streets of Berlin won a victory and went home and didn't continue. And the nonviolent resistance to the Nazis in Eastern Europe and Scandinavia that was quite effective wasn't continued and expanded because people didn't understand what nonviolence can do, hadn't seen it as it's now been demonstrated to be a far more effective tool than violence, more successful at resisting tyranny and oppression and occupation than violence. Not guaranteed, but far more likely to succeed, and those successes far more likely to be lasting than when you use violence. And then there's always the problem of, if you're going to go back 75 years to justify dumping my grandchildren's as yet to be earned pay into a criminal enterprise next year and the next year and the next year, why can't we go back 85 or 95 years and say, why did we have to create World War II in the first place? Why end World War I in a manner that wise people predicted on the spot was going to create World War II? Why do that? Why Wall Street fund Nazis for decades as preferable to communists? Why do that? Why can't we proceed with public policy from today forward that doesn't encourage an arms race and militarism and fascism, that in fact works to avoid crises, and then when crises arise, settle them nonviolently with the support of the rule of law? If the United States supported international law and international justice, that would be a huge step. Why not humanitarian aid? I mentioned this to the students, but I'll say it again. I read a few weeks ago an U.S. Air Force officer or expert of some sort who said, we have a system for dropping food from high elevation in high winds and landing it more accurately in Syria, where people are starving to death and the UN can't drop food anywhere near them. They can't find the food. They continue starving to death. But this would cost $60,000 to use this technology, so we would never use it for a purely humanitarian operation. As a matter of principle, the U.S. government, what we all talk about as we in the first person, these are our priorities, as a matter of principle, would not spend $60,000 to save lives from starvation. Well, every single missile costs over $1 million each. Well, we are dumping about $1 trillion a year into militarism, right? Why not spend vastly less and make the United States loved rather than hated, and encourage peace and stability rather than violence and chaos? But if you look at World War II, it doesn't look anything like the myths that are in all the movies and all the stories. For one thing, it had absolutely nothing to do with saving Jews or other victims in camps. There were peace activists who stressed that before and during the war and wanted the war ended to stop the killing and wanted negotiations to end it sooner. There were those who wanted Jewish refugees to be accepted somewhere in the world, even in this country. But the majority of Americans, to their eternal shame, did not. And their president did not. And his wife, contrary to other former presidents' wives who might be running for presidents, claim that they can't contradict their husband. Eleanor contradicted her husband all the time and said, let the Jewish children in, But there were ships full of hundreds of Jewish refugees within sight of Miami, Florida, chased away by the Coast Guard, and hundreds of them killed by the Nazis. It had nothing to do with saving them until after the war was over. No steps were taken. And the millions who were killed in those camps were less than 10% of the millions killed in the war. Millions killed by the United States, millions killed by Germany outside the camps, more than inside the camps, millions killed by every country involved in the single worst thing ever to happen on this planet in any short space of time, World War II. And so to justify it as somehow necessary, and Roosevelt's lies and forged documents about Nazi plans to carve up South America and eliminate religion and innocent ships being attacked that were actually supporting British planes and all, these were not lies necessary to trick the ignorant U.S. public into supporting something that was difficult but good. These were lies like the lies that get every war going. This was not a defensive war. This was a war that Roosevelt had promised Churchill he was going to get in, that he did everything possible to provoke a Japanese attack for, and that night drafted a declaration of war against Japan and Germany. Was talked out of Germany. This was something that should have been avoided decades earlier, should have been avoided on the spot, should not have been escalated into the form that gave us all-out war on civilians and the absolutely unjustifiable dropping of nuclear bombs on cities, to which President Obama is about to go and visit and not apologize and possibly seek to justify, like John Kerry. This is absolutely inexcusable. And so to paint this moral picture of goodness in the United States, where we had an apartheid state for African Americans and Japanese Americans in camps and eugenics and human experimentation going before, during, and after that war, because the Nazis were evil, was not that the Nazis weren't evil. It's that the war had nothing to do with that. And if you wanted to stop supporting those evil programs, you could have done so in the 20s and the 30s, not just in that moment of crisis. So if you want to hear my rap on the Civil War or the Revolution or any other war, tell me which war, and we'll do it. But I don't have there's not a war that I don't think I can give you a good, at least a good plausible argument on. And even if I couldn't, you have to then make the case that justifies future wars. The other one that, of course, comes up now is ISIS. If you don't want to have wars, Do you want to just let them get away with it? Let them kill people? Right? I mean, again, while the United States is arming and funding governments like Saudi Arabia's that execute with knives in a similar manner far more people than ISIS, this particular enemy is supposed to be a problem. Never mind that it was created by the U.S. war in Iraq and the U.S. war in Syria and the proliferation of weapons from the overthrow in Libya and so on. Never mind that it put out videos begging the United States to attack it, and the United States attacked it and its recruitment soared. Never mind that top U.S. officials are retiring every year and then blurting out that it's counterproductive, that you're creating more enemies than you're killing. I mean, never mind that the weapons in the Middle East are primarily from the United States. And hatred and anger are always going to exist, but they're going to do a lot more damage when they are armed to the teeth. This is a crisis that can be better handled by not continuing to make it worse, and by sending in humanitarian aid, and by negotiating disarmament, and by expanding a ceasefire into a real peace, and diplomatically resolving the situation, which is given lip service in the White House, but not serious attention. So once you start looking at every war in the way that I do, and maybe you're not all there yet, but when you cease to find any good ones, then you start asking, why don't we get rid of it? Why don't we abolish it? We have abolished or moved far down the line toward abolishing numerous evils that were once taken for granted as natural and inevitable and good, from slavery through dueling, through lynching, through family feuds and retribution against clans, the trials that used to be conducted by testing people for God to determine whether they are innocent or guilty. I mean, all sorts of bizarre forms of violence and evil that have been accepted as absolutely normal and unquestionable. I mean, when the movement to abolish slavery grew up in England and in this country, most people on earth were slaves. And that had been the case for centuries. It was absolutely normal and natural and inevitable and justified by the Bible and so forth. And it was radically diminished and made immoral and illicit and illegal in a relatively short period of time. And it was not done by electing a slightly less disastrous candidate for president than some other one. It was done by building a moral movement, by educating people, by nonviolent resistance, by developing alternative forms of economics and livelihood. And it was done in most places without a war. I think if we start thinking in those terms, then we start looking at steps to get there. And if you wanted to talk about defense and cling to this idea of military defense, why not cut the United States Department of so-called defense back to something resembling other countries on earth? Why not, as Smedley Butler urged many years ago, restrict the U.S. military to within 200 miles of the U.S.? You would thereby eliminate 90% of so-called defense spending, which has no defensive purpose and is absolutely unheard of by any other country. Raise your hand if you can name the 7 nations President Obama has bragged about bombing. Yeah, but you were here when we did this like an hour ago. There has never, ever before been a country that couldn't keep track of its wars. This is new. This is unprecedented. Never before has there been a public debate for the top office in a government where the candidates were asked on television, are you willing to kill thousands of innocent children as part of your basic responsibility as commander-in-chief? As presidential candidate was asked in a recent debate. I mean, this is unheard of. Doesn't happen anywhere else on earth and shouldn't. The idea that I came up with for this book then, in War is a Lie, was not to go through every single war, which would get, endless, but to look at types of lies. So I look at the lies about war addressing evil. I look at the lies about war being defensive, the lies about war being humanitarian or philanthropic, which is a relatively new and popular one, but still much less effective than war is defensive. You look at the lies around Libya, where we were told that Gaddafi is about to slaughter innocent civilians, and he wasn't. And he's giving Viagra to his troops so they can rape more, which is just pure fabrication. I mean, all these lies, it's not Gaddafi was some kind of saint, but these were not true statements. They were lies. And then to go to the United Nations and get an authorization to protect the civilians from the non-existent threat, and then immediately start bombing the capital and overthrow the government and create chaos and proliferate weapons around the region and kill more people than Gaddafi ever could have killed. That's not moral, legal, rational, defensible. It had nothing to do. It's why when they said a similar thing about Syria, Russia and China said, oh no, you said that about Libya. Not this time. Why they fell for it on Libya, I don't understand, but they didn't go with it on Syria. Well, the United States is doing what it wants in Syria without the United Nations. It's better that it do it without the United Nations. It was better that we could oppose the war on Iraq as a crime for all these years rather than a humanitarian effort. The lies that were told about the chemical weapons in Syria in 2013, that the president had proof of who did it, which he did not. The lies that we've been told about who shot down an airplane in Ukraine, and the endless reports of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia is invading Ukraine again. If they already invaded, why again? And why next month? And why if there were a Russian invasion of Ukraine, we would know about it. There would be pictures, right? It hasn't happened. The lies about the people on the mountaintop, where there was actually a grain of truth. There were people on the mountaintop. Some of them didn't want to be rescued. Some of them were rescued by Kurds. Some of them left of their own accord. But the bombing was almost all directed around where the oil was, and the U.S. personnel that supposedly had to be rescued, even though they all would have fit on a readily available airplane and could have been put on an airplane and flown out of there if it was about rescuing them. It wasn't. It's these humanitarian lies are dangerous because they appeal to people I know. They appeal to people who don't scream, let's kill all the Muslims. They appeal to people who say, let's have wars for good. Let's have humanitarian wars. And so they're damaging. So a number of us have tried to boost the movement for the total abolition of war. And we've started up an organization called World Beyond War with a website, worldbeyondwar.org, where we make the case that war kills mostly through the diversion of funds, not through any weapons. That for tens of billions, we could end starvation. We could provide clean drinking water. We could do incredible things for medicine and education and clean energy, where we're putting $1 trillion from the United States and another $1 trillion from everybody else into a criminal enterprise. It's those trade-offs. Never mind that we could have all those nice things you see in Michael Moore's latest movie that other countries get to have, like education as a right and healthcare as a right and retirement and vacation and so forth, for far less money. We make the case that war is the top destroyer of the natural environment, that the U.S. military, the biggest consumer of petroleum on Earth, never mind that it fights so many wars over that petroleum, is the biggest destroyer of the environment, that it is the biggest destroyer of our civil liberties, the biggest promoter of racism in our culture, that it militarizes our local police, that it concentrates wealth, that it promotes violence and cruelty, and the nuclear danger, which did not go away and continues to grow. And President Obama is not just going to Hiroshima. He's going to Hiroshima while building more nuclear weapons that the U.S. government is talking about as being smaller and therefore more usable. More usable. You give an argument for that, but try to give an argument that's sane. Try to give an argument that's in any way reasonable at all for the idea that a nuclear weapon can be usable. mean, this is madness. So when people come to this topic and they haven't been there before, you know, they can get depressed, they can get sad that the U.S. government, doesn't just tell lies, but it does evil things, which is why it has to tell lies, because we aren't all evil, thank goodness. But we can also get encouraged and get happy that 96% of humanity is represented by governments putting dramatically less into militarism and war than the U.S. government. So it isn't actually the norm. When 4% of humanity does something this month, it's declared human nature, as if the other 96% of humanity deviates from human nature, and the United States defines it. But it's actually good news that at least 90% of humanity is funding and supporting war far less, and in many cases not at all. And that even in this country, in the United States, 99% of the people have nothing to do with participating in war and don't want to. I mean, you can do a poll of the U.S. public and other publics around the world, different nations. Would you fight in a war for your country? And in some countries, you get single digits. You get 10%, 20%. You get the vast majority saying, no, I wouldn't fight in a war for my country. In the United States, I think the last I saw was 44% saying, I would fight in a war for my country. Well, what's stopping you? We got more wars than we can count. These are not people who actually want to fight in a war. They want to think of themselves as fighting in a war. It's acceptable in cultural terms for war to be happening, and they want to think of themselves as somehow participating, but they don't really want to. They don't really want to. There is not yet a single documented case in a hospital anywhere on earth of post-traumatic stress disorder from war deprivation. And the number one killer of U.S. troops is suicide. They come home and kill themselves. So the idea that it's natural or inevitable is just ridiculous and insulting. So a world beyond war is not some fantasy. It is a beautiful, far more humanitarian, sustainable, enjoyable place than what we've got now, and more different from what we've got now than we can possibly imagine. And once we get to no more war, we also get to no more arms trade. As the Pope again told Congress, end the arms trade, and they cheered for him and continued the arms trade. The United States is the top armor of the world, and this is what produces the wars. That has to end. And when it ends, that benefits the U.S. economy as well as the U.S. morality and the natural environment and everything else. I want to close with something that the great peacemaker who united the Iroquois nations said. Quote, I and the Confederate lords now uproot the tallest pine tree, and into the cavity thereby made we cast all weapons of war. Into the depths of the earth, down into the deep underneath currents of water flowing into unknown regions, we cast all weapons of strife. We bury them from sight forever and plant again the tree. Thus shall all great peace be established, and hostilities shall no longer be known between the five nations, but only peace to a united people. Let's follow that example. It's nothing new, but we need to make it happen. I want to pass around a clipboard that's in the back of the room now that's from worldbeyondwar.org that has a very short statement, not unlike what I just read, that has been signed by people in 133 countries and growing. And we are planning a big conference in Washington, D.C. on alternatives to war in September that you'll find out about if you go to worldbeyondwar.org. And I would love to take any questions, and thank you for coming here.